Hello everyone, I'm Becky Goldsmith with Piece of Cake, and this is video number 7 in the Searching for Beauty video series. And in this video I'm talking to you about a technique that Linda and I called Applique with Attitude. In it, you applique your pieces down using visible stitches that are intended to show. They hold the shape under, and I really like to turn the edges under, so it's needle turn in that I'm still using my needle to turn the stitches under. I'm just making usually a running stitch, but there are other alternatives. Now let me back this back up just for a second, because you can do the whole block with this technique, but it looks different. I like to combine regular needle turn applique with the higher profile stitches with attitude. And here I've even thrown in some machine applique, so I'm getting different looks from each technique. And you can see it even a little more here, where the two big circles here are machine appliqued, and they are appliqued with two different stitches. So one has the straight stitch and one has the blanket stitch, and they're both nice. I liked that combination. The orange ovals are done with an invisible stitch, but then here, let me back this up so you can see it better. This fabric with the eyes, I wanted to make it pop a little bit more, so these are appliqued down with the number 12 pearl cotton and a running stitch, as is this circle here, but I like the quieter look of invisible applique on the center circle. So the choice you make highlights or quiets down the edge of the applique shape. So let me show you how it's done. Now I have to wear a leather thimble pad on my finger, because otherwise the end of the the end of the needle goes through my finger, and I don't like that. Now this is out of sequence. I still need to applique down these smaller circles, but because it was time to do the video, I decided to show you on this oval right here. I finger pressed the edges before I pinned the shape to the block. My seam allowance it's a pretty healthy 3/16 of an inch. If it was a little bigger, it wouldn't be bad, but I definitely would not want it to be smaller. I've loaded my needle, and this is the number 9 bow and crewel needle. For this, I'm using the Aurifil 12 weight cotton on a spool. This is out of my Cantha set, the one that this lovely set here. So that's where that thread came from. This is the same weight in Wonderfil. This is spaghetti. I've used it in some blocks. And I've also used what's here in the middle. I've used the 12 weight Presencia pearl cotton. Each one of these is a little different from the other, but they are all basically good for this particular technique. When you do invisible hand applique, what I've told you is to bring your needle up from underneath the applique. And here, that doesn't work quite as well because you're going to have a big knot, and I haven't tied my knot yet. It's the same knot, but you only need to wrap the thread around the needle once. So I always begin with the tail end of the thread pointing up, like that. I grab the body of the thread, wrap it once, hold it tight, pull it through, there's my knot. Now that, because the thread is thick, that's a pretty good size knot, and I don't necessarily want it right under the edge of the applique. So what I do is this. I spot where that edge is going to be, and I want to start on one of these two sides of the oval because they're a little bit flatter. I'd like to start right about there. So I'm going to turn this over, like spot, yeah, right about there. I'm going to pick up the background fabric underneath the edge of the applique, just some of it, and pull that through so that the knot and tail of thread are buried farther under the edge of the applique. Now, something else to consider here. Because of the way this fabric is shadowing through, I may end up cutting that background away. And if I do, my knot is really in the wrong place. It needs to be a little closer to the edge so that when I trim away that background fabric, and speaking of that, I do not always trim away the background. In these blocks, I've done more of that than I typically do, where, here I've got one finished, I can turn this over. Where the circles are really big, I've trimmed it away. Where the shapes are smaller, not so much, if the underneath fabric is not shadowing through. But this red fabric is thin enough, it's a vintage fabric, and the fabric behind is bold enough that I think I am going to have to trim that. So, one more time, I've tied my knot. I'm going to mark that right there. So here, I'm going to catch a little closer to the edge of the applique than I do when I'm not going to trim that away. So I'm anchoring the knot and the tail there. Then I'm going to come to the front and flip that seam allowance under. Whoops. And then I will go, sorry, I'm moving that around a lot. I'm sorry about that. It's getting caught. I'm going to come up, and what you're doing here, let me pull this, whoa, wait, that's there, that's better. All right, what I'm doing here is coming up just inside the fold. If I come up too close to the fold, it doesn't catch as well. If I come up too far away from the fold, then the outer edge, it's like it wants to lift up. It doesn't play well. So you want to find the sweet spot, and it may vary from fabric to fabric. I'm holding the needle the way I do when I'm doing regular hand applique. So that part right there where my leather thimble pad is, that's what's at the eye end of the needle. I'm going to go straight down, and wherever I put my needle in, that's going to determine how much of the top of that stitch shows. So I'm going to go straight down. I feel the end of the needle on my middle finger underneath. I'm going to rock across it, bend over the underneath finger, and come up. So in many ways, it's like a hand applique stitch, except that it's a running stitch and it's going to be visible. And there will be times when you may be able to pack more than one stitch, like I just did there, and other times where you cannot. So for example, as I come around this outer curve, remember as you go around a curve, if you want not to make pleats, you turn under one stitch at a time. That I just did there. So here really I can only do one stitch, and then I would do another and another. You can vary the length of these stitches as long as you remember that this is the stitch that's holding your applique shape to the block. If you make those stitches too long, or the space between them too long or too short or whatever it is, it may not hold the fabric to the block as well. As I am sewing around, and I don't know that I've said this in the other videos, as I make progress, If I no longer need a pin, I remove it as I go, but until then, they stay put. Now, so that's the running stitch. I think you've got it. It's similar in some ways to a hand quilting stitch, but you're holding the needle differently. All right, so that's that stitch. Now, there is another stitch you can make, and it looks like this. Can you see that it's a stitch that's perpendicular to the edge of the applique? The way you make that is this. So let's pretend like you're making a regular applique stitch, but you want it to show. If I were to go in right next to the edge of the applique and turn my needle and come up here, and I did that again, it would make that kind of a stitch. Now, you have to be careful when you are making these stitches to pay attention to where you put the needle in, because you could very easily end up with stitches that are kind of wonky. So if you need to, you can pull the thread out from the edge of the applique and kind of spot where you need it to be, and you can make a stitch. Now, that is not a bad look, and it's an interesting look to mix in with the running stitch where you want more texture. So for example, with this, I could switch back and forth between the smoother running stitch and the more textured, we called this a mock blanket stitch because it doesn't have that horizontal leg at the edge of the applique. Now, I would not do a blanket stitch here, not a straight up embroidery blanket stitch, because it doesn't hold the edge down as well. But a variation of this that you can do is, instead of always bringing your needle in kind of close to the edge, you can come farther into the applique. And because this is so long, if you put your needle in out here, it's going to leave that edge loose. But if you put your needle in kind of near the folded edge, that gives you a whole other look. And it's holding the edge down. It's tidy. It's nice, right? You can draw X's, you could do dashes, you could do any kind of stitch that suits you, as long as it neatly holds the applique, well, even neatly, maybe not so neatly, but as long as it securely holds the applique to the block. You could do this with raw edge applique if that suits you. I just happen to prefer a turned edge. This is really a jumping off place. So I like 12 weight pearl cotton. You might want something finer or something thicker. I typically like thread that blends a little bit, usually, not always, but usually. You might want to use a high contrast thread, this done in black or dark brown or dark blue. It would be nice. It would be different. It would be nice. It depends on where you want the attention to be when viewers see your quilt. The higher the contrast the thread is, the more visible it will be and the more it will jump out when people look at the quilt. I hope you're enjoying making your Searching for Beauty quilt. I look forward to seeing your quilts as you finish them. Please do send me pictures. May you have many happy stitches. Thanks for watching.